I used to think no one ever came back to complain about a poorly done burial, until I heard my name whispered, coming from beneath the earth. I've spent the last 20 years burying the forgotten, digging graves for those who had no one. I was alone, always alone. But lately, something has changed. I started hearing cries for help from one of the freshly opened graves, and the name being whispered is mine. Now the guilt of an old mistake is beginning to rise from the ground. If you've ever felt like someone still needed to be heard, even after death, tell your story in the comments. I read every single one. I never minded the silence. In fact, I welcomed it. I've been digging graves for over 20 years, and the quiet was always more loyal than the living. It wrapped around you like fog in the early mornings, thick, patient, undisturbed, the kind of silence that lets a man think without interruption, or better yet, forget. Most folks assume that cemeteries are for the dead, but the truth is, they're built by the forgotten, the unvisited, the ones who die with no one to miss them. No names left behind that anyone dares speak. They don't get headstones carved by loving hands. They don't get flowers from grieving children. No, they get what we call paupers' graves. Shallow, fast, cold. I used to think of them as storage, to be honest. Places where society shelves what it doesn't want to remember. I started back in '02, fresh out of bad luck and with a back strong enough for the kind of labor nobody wants to brag about. I wasn't hired because I knew anything. I was hired because I had 2 arms, no questions, and the willingness to show up before the sun and leave after it died. The boss said, "You'll handle the ones without families, the lonely ones." I didn't argue. I just nodded. They put me in charge of the northeast corner, the patch nobody walks through unless they have a reason. Even the map labels it Section E in faded ink, as if embarrassed to admit it exists. It runs along a stretch of trees that don't quite die but never bloom either. The soil there is strange, wet even in the dry months, sour-smelling, with roots that seem to shift every time you dig too deep. Most people avoid that area. I've spent half my life in it. At first I kept count. Each one was a number in a little black notebook I carried in my back pocket. I wrote them down like receipts. Grave 001, Grave 002, up to 063 before I stopped. Not because I ran out of room, but because it all started to blur. Same depth, same linen-wrapped form, same lack of name. You start thinking they're all the same person. A rotation of faces erased before you meet them. There's something hollow in burying someone no one claims. You tell yourself you're just doing a job, but some part of you starts wondering who they were, why they died alone, and whether someone, anyone, is out there still unaware that the person they once knew is now under 6 feet of unmarked dirt. Sometimes, just sometimes, I'd imagine a mother sitting on a worn couch, wondering why her son hadn't called in years, or a man walking past a missing person poster, never realizing his sister's bones were 10 yards from my boot print. No ceremony, no prayer, no music, just me, my shovel, and the weight of another body wrapped in city-issued cloth, stiff and silent. Over time, I developed a rhythm. I'd arrive early, prep the site, lower the body in without fuss, quick, clinical, the way the city wanted it, the way I told myself was necessary. I stopped bringing my lunch to the grave sites after the rats took interest. I stopped smoking when I realized the smell of the earth never really leaves your fingertips, and tobacco only makes it cling harder. But here's the part no one tells you. The dead may be silent, but their presence lingers, especially the ones no one remembers. It's as if their identities stripped from them in life try to bloom back out of the soil, a twitch in the grass, a coldness in the air that settles deeper than weather, a feeling you're being watched, even though the only eyes left are buried beneath you. There was one week, I couldn't say which year, where I buried 6 men in a row, all unclaimed, all nameless. I didn't think much of it until I realized that not one of their bodies had a death certificate attached. The tags on their toes were handwritten, smudged, just numbers. No initials, no age, just units to be disposed of. That's when I stopped keeping track. The job became less about graves and more about muscle memory. The names didn't matter because they never existed, not to anyone who cared. The funny thing is, after a while you start to hear your own voice less and less. Days pass without a word, except maybe a grunt when the shovel hits a root or the earth collapses wrong. I think that's when the cemetery becomes more than a place. It becomes a rhythm. A way of being. You rise, you bury, you rest. The ground breathes with you. Over time, I got used to being the only one talking. Sometimes I muttered to the dirt, not because I expected an answer, but because it helped to pretend I wasn't alone. "Easy in," I'd say, or "You'll rest better here." Words didn't cost me anything, and it felt right. I didn't know their names, but I could still acknowledge them. They say when someone dies without family, it's like a book burning before it's read, and I suppose that's true. But bury enough of those burned books, and the ashes start whispering back. You just have to be quiet enough to hear. Section E had its patterns. Some graves settled fast, some sunk over time. Sometimes the earth rejected a casket. Other times, it swallowed one hole without so much as a mound. I never questioned it. That was the rule. Dirt in, dirt out. Don't ask questions. Don't get curious. That's how you last in this line of work. But there was one time, a single moment, that set everything in motion. It wasn't a storm, or a voice, or even something supernatural. It was the absence of something. The absence of paperwork, of witnesses, of weight. The man they brought me didn't feel like the others. His skin was too intact, his frame too solid, his eyes not quite closed. I didn't know it then, but I should have paid attention. That grave, the one I'd come to know as number 547, changed everything. But before that day, I was just the man who buried the ones no one knew. No questions, no stories, just holes in the ground. And silence. Always silence. The silence wasn't just in the air. It settled inside me. It crawled into my bones like the cold, and it never really left. 20 years is a long time to spend among the forgotten. Long enough that your own memories start to fade, like weathered names on cracked headstones. I used to think I'd remember every face I buried. Not the details, just the weight of them. But eventually, they all became the same quiet burden. A silence pressed into a sack of flesh and bone, lowered into earth without a witness. I didn't tell anyone what I did. Not really. People get uncomfortable when you say you bury the nameless. They either look at you like you're haunted or worse, like you're invisible. So I just told folks I worked maintenance, groundskeeping, fixed fences, cut grass, that sort of thing. It wasn't a lie, not entirely, but it kept people from asking more. And in my line of work, questions were dangerous. Still, sometimes I caught myself wondering, where did they come from? Who did they leave behind? A few wore hospital gowns. Others came in city morgue bags with no tag but a case number. One arrived in nothing but a blanket, dirt still clinging to the edges like he'd been pulled from somewhere he wasn't meant to be. It's not my job to know. But it's hard to lower someone into the ground and not wonder who cried for them, or if anyone did at all. I never had a family of my own. Grew up in the system, bounced from place to place, the kind of kid teachers forget about by spring semester. Maybe that's why the work didn't bother me. Maybe that's why I was drawn to the silence. There's something honest about it. The dead don't pretend to care. They don't judge. They just wait. Over time, I developed rituals. Little habits to keep myself grounded. I'd tap the shovel 3 times before the first dig, always with the same rhythm. I'd whistle an old hymn I didn't know the words to, just the tune. On Sundays, I'd leave a single penny near the base of every fresh grave. No one told me to. No one ever gave me a handbook for how to bury the forgotten. There was no formal training, no orientation. What I learned by repetition and silence. You develop your own rules over time, not the kind they write down, but the ones that grow out of habit, or guilt, or something deeper you can't name. The cemetery has its own rhythm, and if you stay long enough, your heartbeat starts to match it. And that's when you begin to understand. The dead without names still deserve something. Even if the world turned its back on them, there was an unspoken system, a protocol, if you could call it that, for handling those who died without a claim, a family, or even an identity. The bodies came from hospitals, from jails, sometimes straight from the street. The city filed them under unclaimed remains and passed them to us with a thin manila envelope and a chain of shrugged shoulders. There were no services, no family cars following behind, no prayers, just a date, a location, and a hole to be filled. Those graves always went to the far end of Section E, what some of the newer workers nicknamed the quiet strip. It's a strip of earth where the grass grows dull, where no one comes to visit, and where no flowers ever bloom on their own. No one plants anything there. The soil is always damp, almost spongy, the kind that sucks at your boots like it wants to keep a piece of you. We dug those graves shallower than the rest. Budget reasons, they said. Time constraints. I didn't argue. A regulation grave goes down 6 feet, but for the unclaimed, we were told 4 would do. They said it with the same tone you'd use when deciding to buy store-brand cereal instead of the name brand. Just numbers, just cost. But it always made my hands pause on the shovel. 4 feet didn't feel like enough to forget a person. The coffins were basic, cheap pine if you were lucky. Otherwise just a body bag and a zipper. Sometimes they came with no covering at all, just a sheet pulled over a face already slipping into wax. I learned to stop looking. You stare long enough at a face that no one else will ever see again, and it sticks with you. You wake up thinking about the tilt of their chin, the bruise under the eye, the way their fingers curl inward like they were holding on to something they lost. There was a rule among the staff, though no one ever admitted it out loud: don't ask questions. If they didn't have a name, it wasn't your place to give them one. If they didn't have a past, it wasn't your job to imagine it. Dig the hole, lower the body, cover it, move on. That's how you last in this business. That's how you keep the whispers away. But I broke that rule in my own way. You see, I started saying something. Not much, just a few words. I told myself it wasn't a prayer because I wasn't a praying man, and I wasn't trying to sanctify anything. I just couldn't stand the idea of putting someone in the ground with absolutely nothing spoken into the air. So I started saying the same sentence each time, right before the final shovelful of dirt went in. I remember you now. Go easy. That was it. 6 words, said softly, like a secret. Sometimes I whispered them so low I wasn't sure if I actually spoke or just mouthed them. But they were mine, my ritual, my resistance to the idea that these people could vanish without a trace. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they had done. Maybe some had earned the world's silence, maybe not. But in that moment, for that second, they were remembered by someone. Even if it was only me. Other workers thought I was odd. They didn't say it, but I could feel it. The way they looked at me when I spent too long alone at a gravesite. The way they asked why I always volunteered for Section E. Some thought I was just numb. Others thought I liked the quiet too much. But they didn't hear what I heard. They didn't feel the weight that settled after the dirt was packed and the grass laid flat again. There was one burial I remember more than most. A woman, mid-30s maybe, came in late autumn. Her face was swollen in ways that told me her end hadn't been gentle. I asked the delivery man if she had a name. He just shook his head, muttered Jane Doe, and handed me a form with everything but her name blacked out. I buried her next to an old man I'd put in the ground the year before. I said my words. I remember you now. Go easy. And I thought that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks later, I passed by her grave and found a small bouquet of wildflowers resting on the grass, wrapped in string. No note, no tracks in the soil, just flowers. They wilted within a day. No one ever came back. That was when I started leaving pennies. Not for luck, not for superstition, but because I read somewhere that in some cultures, coins placed on graves meant the dead could buy passage, or cross rivers, or speak to the gods. I didn't believe in any of that, not really. But I liked the idea that they could carry something with them. Something small, something mine. A kind of tribute, even if the world never gave them one while they were breathing. Section E began to fill, and with each grave I noticed patterns. The earth settled faster for some than others. Some stayed disturbed longer. There were mornings when I'd find the dirt slightly sunken, as if the ground had inhaled deeply during the night. Other times the grass wouldn't grow back, just stubborn patches of brown. Sometimes, when I walked the rows alone, I could swear I felt someone walking behind me. Not footsteps, just presence, like a question hanging in the fog. It never frightened me. I'd gotten used to being the only one alive among the dead. But it did remind me of something I couldn't shake, that even if they were gone, some part of them still lingered. I've heard folks say cemeteries are for the living, not the dead, that the stones are there for us, to mourn, to remember. Maybe that's true, but in Section E there were no visitors, no grieving relatives, no fresh-cut flowers, just a man with a shovel, a sentence, and a pocket full of coins, and maybe that was enough. But looking back now, I think that ritual, those words, opened something. I didn't know it then, not for years, but maybe the act of speaking to the forgotten is what makes them remember you in return. I don't believe in ghosts. At least I didn't. Not until the night I buried Grave 547, the night the earth didn't settle, the night I stopped being the only voice in Section E because someone whispered back. I've buried hundreds of people, maybe more. I stopped counting a long time ago, somewhere around the 70s. And after that, the graves all started to feel the same. Same earth, same silence, same process. But grave number 547 was different from the moment the van pulled up. It was a Thursday, late October, with the kind of sharp wind that stings your knuckles and sticks to the inside of your ears. The sky was swollen and gray, clouds so low you could almost reach up and brush them. Rain hadn't started yet, but the whole place smelled like it was about to. That metallic, electric weight to the air. I remember the crows were quiet that day, which was strange. Normally they nested along the southern fence and argued all morning. That day they just watched. The van rolled in slower than usual. No markings on the side, just rust bleeding out from beneath the edges of the doors and a windshield wiper that clicked every other pass. I remember the driver didn't step out for a minute or two, just sat there, engine running, head down. When he finally did get out, he avoided eye contact, like he wanted to be anywhere else. He didn't say a word as he opened the back and revealed a single black body bag, zipped all the way to the top. No tags, no paperwork, no city seal, just the bag and silence. I cleared my throat, waiting for the form. Nothing. I asked, "What's the name?" He just shook his head. Unregistered. That was it. One word, and then he was gone, climbing back into the van and pulling away without looking back. I stood there for a moment, staring at the body bag. Normally I'd get at least a file. Age, gender, time of death, anything. Sometimes just a note scrawled on a sticky tab. But this was emptier than usual. He wasn't even on the weekly schedule. I checked my clipboard twice, then a third time. Nothing. Still, I was used to the unclaimed. Maybe a late addition, maybe a mistake. I told myself that, and hauled the bag onto the cart. It was heavier than I expected, not just in weight, but in presence. The kind of heavy that lingers in your arms after you set it down. My gloves stuck to the fabric slightly, like there was static clinging to it or moisture just beneath the surface. The wheels of the cart didn't squeak this time. They usually did. It was one of those sounds I'd grown so accustomed to I didn't realize it until it wasn't there. The walk to Section E was longer than usual. Not by distance, but by feel. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I heard anything, because I didn't. Not even the wind. The trees didn't rustle. The air didn't move. It felt like the world was holding its breath. By the time I reached the site, the sky had begun to drip, soft and cold. Like tears someone was too tired to shed all at once. I prepped the grave the way I always did. 4 feet, clean edges, angled walls. The soil turned too easily, soft and dark, but smelled off. Too sweet, almost. Like old fruit left to rot in the sun. I tried to ignore it. Just the rain waking up the decay, I told myself. It happens sometimes. When I unzipped the bag, I only meant to check for a tag. Sometimes they're stitched into the fabric or tucked under the shoulder. Instead, I saw his face. He was a man, mid-40s maybe, skin pale but not mottled, hair thick and dark, not gray, lips just barely parted. His eyes, that's what caught me. They weren't closed, not fully. Lids relaxed but slightly open like he'd fallen asleep mid-thought. And behind them the eyes weren't glazed or sunken. They were, how do I say this, aware. Like they hadn't finished seeing yet. Like they were still remembering something. There were marks on his hands. Not scars, not bruises, marks. Symbols maybe. Faded like tattoos left too long in the sun, but not in any language I recognized. They wrapped around the knuckles and fingertips in thin, deliberate lines. I didn't linger. I zipped the bag closed again and slid him into the ground. I don't know why I felt the need to say the words louder this time. I remember you now. Go easy. The wind picked up the second I spoke them. A single gust, sharp and sudden, whipped through Section E and rattled the tools in my belt. It carried a smell I hadn't expected. Damp earth, yes, but also something older, like wood smoke and iron. I froze for a moment, shovel raised, heart thudding against my ribs. But then it passed. Gone, just like that. A stray breeze. That's all. I packed the dirt slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because my hands kept hesitating. I'd scoop a load of soil, pause, then toss it in. Again. It took me nearly 40 minutes to fill a hole that normally took 20. Every time the dirt hit the bag, it sounded different, hollow, like the earth didn't want to hold it, like it was waiting for something else. When I was done, I leveled the ground, laid the sod, and marked it in my ledger. Grave number 547. No name, no tag, no origin, just coordinates and a number. That night, I didn't sleep well. My dreams were full of things I couldn't explain. Shadows stretching across concrete, eyes watching from behind mirrors, voices speaking in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. I woke 3 times drenched in sweat, each time with the same image burning behind my eyelids, the face of the man in the bag, still, open-eyed, waiting. The next morning, I returned to the grave before my shift. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Guilt. Something pulled me back. I stood over the fresh mound and noticed the rain had not disturbed the soil. No puddles, no sink. It was untouched, as if it had been packed a week ago. I crouched down, brushed my hand over the dirt, and felt it. Warmth. Not heat, not like a fire or a pipe, but warmth, like skin, like a sleeping body under blankets. I yanked my hand back and stood. The air around me felt wrong, pressurized, heavy, like the grave was breathing through me. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't write it in the report. What would I say? That the ground felt alive? That a dead man's eyes were watching me through 6 feet of soil? No, you don't say things like that. Not if you want to keep your job. Not if you want to keep your sanity. But I knew then, 547 wasn't like the others. I didn't know how or why, but that man hadn't come here by accident. He hadn't been left by mistake. He'd been delivered, quietly, deliberately, and something about him was still listening. Over the next few days, I avoided Section E, took longer routes, assigned new tasks to myself just to keep busy. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the grave again. Perfect, undisturbed, waiting. It was the first time in 20 years that I felt like something I buried might climb back out. And then, 4 days later, I heard my name whispered from beneath the ground. It started with a breeze. That's what I told myself at first. A simple gust of wind, nothing more. But it wasn't the kind that rustles through leaves or sweeps across headstones. No, this one felt different. It moved like it had purpose. It came from a direction that didn't make sense, from below, not across. And it carried a sound that didn't belong in the air. My name, whispered low, drawn out like the first inhale after too long underwater. At first I froze. You'd think after 2 decades spent in the company of the dead, nothing would rattle me. But there's a line that separates routine from wrong, and hearing your name breathed up from the earth is exactly the kind of thing that drags you across it. I stood in the tool shed just before dawn, rinsing mud off a pair of spades when it happened. The back door was open, cracked just enough for the morning fog to creep in. That's when I heard it. Thomas! Not a shout, not a scream, just a gentle murmur, like someone was testing the sound of my name for the first time. And it didn't come from behind me. It came from underneath. The floor, the dirt, the roots. I turned slowly. My heart had already started pounding, not fast, but heavy, thudding, rhythmic, like it was echoing the weight of that voice. I stepped outside, trying to convince myself it was an echo, or maybe just my mind playing tricks. Stress, maybe. Lack of sleep. That's when I looked out toward Section E. The fog was thicker there, always was, but this morning it hugged the ground like a blanket, unmoving, untouched. And right in the middle of it, like a ripple in still water, was the outline of Grave 547. I couldn't see much, just a slight bulge in the fog, the way light bends when something interrupts it. But I felt it. A pull, not physical, not like gravity, but something heavier, like an obligation you forgot you had. I took a step toward it before I realized what I was doing, then another. Each step across the gravel felt louder than it should have. My boots crunched like bones. The crows that normally greeted me at sunrise were nowhere to be seen. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of my name again, closer this time. Thomas. The second whisper came as I passed the southern gate. That's when I knew it wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't repeat itself. Wind doesn't call you by name. By the time I reached Section E, the fog had shifted slightly. Not parted, shifted, as if something moved within it, not through it. The air smelled of wet stone and copper. I approached Grave 547 slowly, every hair on my arms standing on end. The soil was untouched, still packed, still perfect. But the ground beneath my boots, it hummed. Not with sound, with sensation, like something deep below was vibrating ever so slightly, a slow, steady thrum, and the temperature. It was warmer there just above that grave, like heat had risen from the earth itself. I knelt down, placed my hand against the soil, and listened. At first, nothing, just silence. Then, the faintest shift of air, like breath, then the whisper, "Thomas, help." That was the first time I heard it speak more than my name. And I knew, I don't know how, but I knew, that it was the man I had buried. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't malicious. It was pleading, dry, desperate. A sound too fragile to carry weight, and yet it sank into me like cold water through fabric. I staggered back, heart racing, breath short. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone, maybe a cruel joke from one of the younger workers. But I was alone, completely, utterly, alone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the house, every car that passed too slowly, every shifting shadow. I kept hearing his voice in the back of my mind, not repeating, just lingering, like it had found a place inside me and refused to leave. The next morning, I went back. Same time, same tool shed. I washed my hands without reason, just to do something familiar. Then I opened the back door, and again, the whisper, "Thomas." I didn't walk out right away. I stood there, gripping the rusted edge of the sink, my breath catching in my throat. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to close the door and pretend I hadn't heard. But the other part, the one that had whispered, "I remember you now," to every nameless body for 2 decades, that part knew better. Somewhere deep down, I felt it. This wasn't random. Grave 547 wasn't just another number. That man, whoever he was, had been put there for a reason, and that reason had something to do with me. I made my way out to the grave again, moving slower than the day before. The fog didn't part, but this time I noticed it curled around me, not repelling me, but embracing me, as if I had already become part of whatever it was. When I reached the grave, the humming had grown stronger, still subtle, still soft, but unmistakable. This time, I didn't speak. I didn't kneel. I just stood there and listened. For several minutes, nothing. Then, "Thomas, not finished, not done." The voice was weaker than before, but clearer, like it had used all its strength just to reach me. It sent chills down my spine, but not from fear, from recognition. Somewhere in the back of my mind, something stirred. A memory I couldn't place, a feeling I didn't understand. Not done, not finished. What wasn't finished? I wanted to ask, but my throat wouldn't move. My lips were dry. The words wouldn't come. I walked back to the shed in silence, shaking. I didn't tell the others. I couldn't. They'd call it stress, burnout, hallucinations. Maybe they'd be right, but I knew. This wasn't in my head. This was real as the soil under my nails, as real as the pennies I left on every grave. I opened the old logbooks that night, the ones from before my time, handwritten, brittle with age. I looked for anything, any mention of the man I'd buried, but there was nothing. No entry for 547, no name, no date of delivery. It was as if he had been lowered into the earth without history, like he had appeared just to be buried. And now, buried, he was calling back, my name, again and again. And I began to wonder, was it really his voice? Or was it mine, coming back to me from below, an echo of something I had forgotten, something I had buried, not in the ground, but in myself. The next morning I didn't wait for the voice. I walked straight to the grave before sunrise, tools in hand, breath fogging in the air. I didn't know what I meant to do. Dig him up? Speak to the soil? Beg for understanding? But when I got there, the grave was exactly as I left it, perfect, undisturbed, except for one thing. A single penny, tarnished and old, sat atop the mound, not the one I had placed. I never placed one on 547. I'd hesitated. I'd forgotten. But now someone had remembered for me. And I knew, without a doubt, that the man beneath the earth had waited 20 years for something, for someone. And now he had spoken my name, and I had no choice but to listen. You bury enough bodies, and eventually you start hearing things. Most people wouldn't admit that. Most coveros, if there were many left like me, would chalk it up to fatigue, to the way the wind funnels through cracked tombstones, or how soil shifts under pressure. You tell yourself it's nothing. You lie to yourself for survival. But I stopped lying after that third morning. It was just after dawn again, fog rolling over the grass like spilled milk, thick and low, dragging against my shins. I hadn't slept, couldn't. The whisper from the day before had wrapped itself around my brain like ivy. Not finished, not done, not finished, not done. I said it under my breath without realizing. I muttered it into my coffee. I wrote it in the margins of the maintenance logs. I felt it beneath my boots as I walked. Grave 547 had become more than a number. It was a pulse, It throbbed in the quiet corners of my day, even when I tried to ignore it. That morning, I didn't bother with gloves or protocol. I walked straight out to Section E with bare hands and muddy boots, still wearing the shirt I'd fallen asleep in hours earlier. The fog parted just slightly as I stepped toward the grave, like it recognized me. I stood over the mound, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. At first it was like the soil exhaled. The top layer shifted, not visibly, but the way tension leaves a surface. I crouched, one hand on my knee, the other brushing over the dirt. The warmth was there again, just like before. Not heat, warmth, the kind of lingering human presence that shouldn't exist 6 feet beneath a grave. And then the voice came again, fainter, dry. "Thomas, help." But this time, it didn't stop there. Still here, still buried. It was a whisper, but not like before. This one scraped, like it was being forced through a throat lined with dust. It came from the very center of the grave, from underneath the packed layers of clay and stone and water-soaked pine. I pressed my hand flat against the mound. "Tell me," I whispered. "Tell me what you want." The answer was a sound I hadn't expected. A sob. Low, wet, nearly silent. But there. Not animal, not wind. Human. Grieving. It bubbled up through the earth like water seeps through a cracked pipe. Slow and searing. And then came the words. "You forgot me." That stopped my breath cold. Forgot? I didn't know him. I hadn't recognized his face, hadn't known his name, hadn't even received a tag when I buried him. How could I forget someone I never knew? Unless I did. I stood there for a long time, watching the fog curl and uncurl at my feet, my fingers twitching, the voice circling inside my skull like a vulture. The soil was still, but I could feel it. Something had changed beneath it. It wasn't just a grave anymore. It was a wound, and I'd cut it. Later that day I went to the archives, the real ones, not the digital files the city half-maintained, but the old ledgers stored in the stone basement beneath the chapel. The ones written by hand, decades before I took the job. I spent 4 hours flipping through them, fingers blackened by ink and dust, looking for the number. Nothing. It didn't exist in any record, which was impossible. I'd written it down myself, entered it into the current ledger, logged the coordinates, but there was no record of it ever being assigned. I flipped through every page dating back to 1989, no 547, not in Section E, not anywhere. Every other number was accounted for, except that one. The space between my ribs tightened. What did it mean for a grave to not exist on paper but live in soil? The next morning, I returned with a spade. I told myself I wasn't going to use it. Just wanted to feel the weight of it in my hand. Something familiar, something sane. But as I stood over grave 547, the earth murmured again. "You left me." I dropped the spade. It landed blade first into the soft soil, and when I bent to pick it up, I saw something that made my breath leave my body. A handprint, not mine, too small, too shallow, pressed into the dirt like someone had reached up, not from above, but from within. 4 fingers and a thumb, clean and symmetrical, right in the center of the mound. I stumbled back, fell on one knee, eyes locked on that indentation. My mouth went dry. I'd seen hundreds of graves settle. Sometimes the soil caves slightly as the coffin shifts or the ground adjusts. Sometimes animals dig, but this was none of that. This was deliberate. This was a mark, a message. He wanted out. No, he wanted heard. And somehow, he thought I was the one who could listen. "Who are you?" I asked aloud, voice shaking. The answer came not in words this time, but in another sound, scratching. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging through wet dirt just beneath the surface. It circled, spiraling from the center outward, and I knew in that moment that he wasn't just asking for help. He was looking for something, something I'd taken, something I'd forgotten. I ran. I didn't mean to. My body just moved. I left the spade. I left the section. I didn't stop until I was back inside the shed, slamming the door behind me and pressing my back against it like a child afraid of the dark. That night, I didn't dream. Or maybe I did, but I didn't wake from it. The memory of the sob, the handprint, the scratching. It all blurred together until I couldn't tell if it had happened outside or inside my own skull. I looked at my hands and felt dirt under my nails that I hadn't remembered digging. The next day, grave 547 looked untouched again. The handprint was gone. The spade was right where I'd left it, but clean. No soil clung to the blade. No indentation where it had sunk. Only one thing remained. The whisper. Every morning now, it returns. Thomas. Every night in my sleep, I hear the scratching. Sometimes I wake with dirt on my sheets, fine and black and smelling faintly of moss and rain. Sometimes I hear the voice in my own chest. Still here. I haven't told anyone. Who would believe me? I'm the only one who works Section E. No cameras, no witnesses, just me, the dead, and whatever I buried alive in that grave. Not a man, not anymore. A voice, a memory, a presence pressing up from beneath the mud, demanding to be remembered, to be released, to be finished. And I'm starting to wonder, what if it wasn't him calling my name? What if it was me, calling myself back to a memory I buried long ago, a grave without a name, and a guilt that has just begun to speak? The worst part about madness isn't when it starts, it's when it starts to make sense, when you begin to question not just the world around you, but the paper trail that once made you feel grounded. For most of my life, I believed in systems, not because I thought they were just, but because they were reliable. The ledgers, the records, the logbooks, they were cold and dry, but they kept the dead where they belonged. They made sense when nothing else did. Until grave 547. After the handprint, after the scratching, after the whisper that now bled into every one of my dreams, I needed answers. I told myself I'd find them the same way I always did, in the lists, in the files, in the comfort of ink on old paper. I believed, maybe foolishly, that if I could trace that man's delivery, if I could find even a single document that proved his arrival, I could breathe again, maybe even sleep. I didn't expect to find much, but I thought I'd find something. I started with the weekly interment schedule. It was stored in the main office, 3 ring binders dated by month and year, handwritten by our previous grounds manager, and kept up with grim consistency. I flipped to the last week of October, the week he arrived. Page after page of scheduled burials, family names, plot numbers, notations about service times, pallbearers, even music requests. Then the section for unclaimed, 5 names, all tagged, all documented, all accounted for. No mention of 547, no delivery time, no corresponding morgue code, no initials. I flipped back and forth for nearly an hour, checking if maybe his entry had been misfiled. Sometimes things happen. A number is skipped, a body arrives early or late, but the gap was too clean, too intentional, so I went deeper. I moved to the city archive room, a dusty sub-basement under the courthouse where interment permits, medical examiner reports, and anonymous death records were stored for legal reasons. I signed in under my groundskeeper credentials, nodded to the sleepy clerk who didn't bother looking up from his crossword, and walked the narrow aisles of metal filing cabinets that smelled like mildew and rusted memories. Section E. Week 43, October, year current. I pulled the drawer, scanned for unnamed bodies, found 3 entries, all marked as buried, all with locations matching my cemetery, all with proper documentation, none listed for plot 547. I checked the burial ledger again. There it was, written in my own hand, 547, unnamed male, mid-40s, arrival date, Oct. 27, no tag, no record provided, interred by T. Madsen. But that entry, it wasn't on any master list. It existed only in my personal log, as if I had invented it, or as if someone had erased it from everywhere else. I ran my finger along the page, my handwriting, my signature. I remembered writing it. I remembered burying him. The weight of the body, the scuffed toe of my boot pressing against the casket's edge, the way the earth had seemed reluctant to receive him. I hadn't imagined that. I couldn't have, and yet, the silence of the paper said otherwise. I returned to the chapel records next, the oldest books, the ones no one touched except when lawsuits demanded evidence or grieving families needed closure. They were bound in leather, the edges cracked like old skin, the ink faded in places, but still legible. I found a master list of all unmarked burials in Section E, dating back to 1974, page after page, every number accounted for. Even 546, even 548, but not 547, not one word. I whispered the number aloud. 547. It sounded wrong in the room, like a combination that didn't fit the lock, as if the number itself had no business being spoken there. I began to wonder, what if it wasn't just a missing file? What if it was deliberate? What if someone had gone out of their way to remove his existence? The thought clung to me like wet wool. I left the records room after that. The air had grown too still, and I kept feeling like someone was reading over my shoulder. The clerk didn't even look up when I passed him again, just muttered something about the weather turning. That night, I found a note, slipped under the door of the shed. No name, no signature, just 6 words, written in a tight, angular script. You buried what wasn't yours. My mouth went dry. I turned the paper over. Nothing else. No date, no stain, no explanation. It hadn't been there the night before. I would have seen it. I rushed to the grave again. 547 was the same as ever, perfectly flat, undisturbed. But I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A stone, small, smooth, oval, placed directly in the center of the mound, not from the surrounding earth. It was darker than our soil, black with red veins running through it like blood in marble. I knelt to touch it, and the second my fingers grazed it, a tremor ran up my arm. Not cold, but buzzing, like static, like a voice with no mouth trying to speak through my bones. I pulled my hand back. Something was wrong with that stone. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong in this cemetery. Maybe not in this world, but I didn't move it. I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I felt if I removed it, something would rise to take its place, or crawl through the gap it left. I returned to the shed and took out every delivery log from my first year on the job. I compared handwriting. I checked initials. Everything matched, until I found an oddity. One sheet near the back, dated October 27th, but from 17 years earlier. The same day, the same month. A delivery logged late at night. Unregistered mail, no details. Handwritten in thick, uneven letters. No signature. The plot number. Illegible, smudged. But if you tilted the paper under the light, the indentations in the page spelled something faint. 547. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the grooves. Had I buried this man before? Was that even possible? Was this a repetition? Or a correction? I looked at my own handwriting in the current log, then at the one from 17 years ago. Too similar, too familiar, and it hit me like a shovel to the chest. I had buried the same man twice. Once when I was new, once now, and both times no records remained. Only a whisper, only a handprint, only my name. The list never existed because someone, maybe something, wanted it that way, and I was starting to suspect that what I'd buried wasn't a man, but a memory, one that refused to stay dead. There's a sound that only old shovels make, not when they strike stone or cut through sod, but when they're picked up after being left out in the rain. It's a brittle creak where the handle meets the shaft, a kind of metallic fatigue that isn't quite mechanical or natural, something in between. That sound echoed in my bones the moment I grabbed the forgotten shovel leaning against the inside of the tool shed wall, the one I hadn't touched in years, the one that, until the night before, I was certain had been stolen or lost. But there it was, standing in the same corner where I always used to keep it, back when I first started, before I learned which tools broke too easily and which ones whispered when they moved. This one, I remembered, had weight. It always had. Not just physical, but emotional, like it carried the memory of every grave it ever touched. That morning when I found it again, the air in the shed was still and sour. The wooden handle was warped from time, the metal dull, pitted with rust. But the second I wrapped my hand around it, something inside me clenched. Not from fear, from recognition, as if the shovel remembered me. I carried it without thought to Section E. The fog wasn't thick that morning. In fact, it had lifted completely, revealing the cemetery in a kind of cruel clarity. The trees stood naked, the grass yellowed, the headstones leaned a little further than they had yesterday, and grave 547 waited at the end of it all, unbothered, patient, as if it had known I'd return, as if the man beneath it knew the exact pace of my breakdown and had timed his silence perfectly. I stopped a few feet from the mound and looked at the shovel in my hand. It felt heavier than it should, not just from age. There was a presence in it, like it carried the weight of something I hadn't admitted yet, like it was judging me. I didn't know what I meant to do. Dig him up, smash the gravestone that wasn't there, curse the ground and demand my sanity back. Instead, I fell to my knees, not out of exhaustion, out of guilt. The kind that crawls up your spine and whispers, "You know what you did," and maybe I did. Maybe I'd always known. 17 years ago, I buried someone under strange orders. No record, no witness. I was told it was a mistake at the morgue. An overflow case, they'd said. Keep it quiet. I was green, fresh into the job, desperate to please. So I did what I was told. I remember the night only in pieces. The dirt sticking to my boots, the casket already scratched, the man's face covered by a cloth that didn't feel quite like cloth. I never logged it, was told not to. Don't ask questions, they said. But now the questions were screaming, and the shovel in my hand. It was the same one I'd used that night. That's why I remembered the creak, the way the blade wobbled slightly when you drove it too deep. It had vanished sometime after that burial. I'd assumed someone stole it, but now I saw the truth. The shovel had been buried with him. I didn't drop it, not this time. I stood and took a single step forward. Grave 547 remained unchanged, but the air around it felt different, still too warm, still too expectant. I could hear a faint humming, not from below, but from the shovel itself, a low vibration that pulsed into my fingertips, steady, accusing. I raised it slowly, not to dig, but to press its edge into the soil, gently. The second I did, I heard it, a groan, from the earth, not loud, not theatrical, but real, like something underneath shifted its weight, like something alive adjusted itself to the pressure above. I pulled the shovel back quickly, breath catching in my throat. The soil where I touched it looked the same, but felt wrong, too soft, too responsive. I leaned in close, whispering to it without meaning to. I didn't know. The answer came instantly. You did. 3 syllables, perfectly timed with my heartbeat. I dropped the shovel. This time, it didn't creak. It thudded, like it had landed on something hollow, like the earth had a chamber now, a place that hadn't been there before. I scrambled back, my boots slipping in the damp grass, my lungs tight with the realization. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't madness. It was memory, weaponized by time. I had buried him twice, once 17 years ago, once weeks ago, both times erasing what little he had left. And now, he was erasing me. I couldn't prove it, but I felt it. Every day since the whisper started, I had become a little less seen. People barely greeted me. The clerk downtown didn't ask my name. The man at the gas station flinched when I waved. It was like I was becoming invisible, like I was being rewritten, like someone or something was overwriting my existence the way I'd overwritten his. When I returned to the shed that evening, the logbook was missing. All of them were. Every book I'd ever written in, gone. In their place, a single slip of paper, 6 words. One of us must be forgotten. It wasn't signed, didn't need to be. I looked at the forgotten shovel still gripped in my muddy hand. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like his, like he'd lent it back to me to dig my own understanding, or maybe my own grave. And in that moment, I finally understood something deeper, darker than guilt. Grave 547 didn't belong to him. It belonged to whoever remembered him. And I had made the mistake of remembering too well. Now the ground was waiting, not to bury him, but to accept the one who broke the rule, the one who looked back. The night I heard the full sentence, the cemetery was colder than I remembered it ever being. Not the kind of cold that bites your skin or stiffens your joints. This was deeper, a hollow cold, like the kind inside a well. Still, dark and echoing. I hadn't been sleeping, not in the real sense of the word. My body would collapse, but my mind never shut off. I'd rest my head and feel dirt in my ears. I'd blink, and in that half-second of darkness, I'd see his eyes again, open, staring up from the casket I never fully remembered lowering. I didn't go to the grave that night because I wanted to. I went because I couldn't not go. There was a pull in my chest, as if someone had wound wire through my ribs and was slowly tugging me forward. I didn't take a flashlight. I didn't put on gloves. I just walked, bare hands, loose breath, heart like a stone in my throat. The cemetery looked different in the moonlight, less like a field of memory, and more like a place that shouldn't exist. The shadows were too sharp. The wind didn't move the trees. Even the stars above looked wrong, distant, dim, like they didn't want to watch what was coming. Section E was silent, but not still. The ground around 547 seemed expectant. That's the only word I have for it. The soil hadn't moved, but it looked softer, like it was breathing. And there were no insects, no nightbirds, no sound, just the long, low hush of something holding its breath. I stopped 2 steps from the grave and spoke without meaning to. Why me? The answer came immediately. You were the last voice I heard. Not a whisper this time, not a vibration through the mud. It was clear, it was human, and it came from just beneath the surface. I staggered back, knees buckling, hands digging into the cold grass. I hadn't realized I was shaking until my fingers clawed the dirt like a dog. I wanted to scream, but the words had cut through everything. They were too familiar. Not the voice, the meaning. 17 years ago, I made a choice. Or maybe I let one be made for me. It was late. I was new. A man from the city morgue brought me a body, told me it needed to be buried quietly. No questions, no records. I didn't argue. I didn't even think. I was trying to impress the superintendent. I wanted the job. I wanted peace. But something went wrong. The man wasn't dead, at least not fully. When I opened the casket, I saw his eyes flutter, just once, and I heard a sound, a breath, barely audible. I told myself it was a trick of the wind. I told myself the brain could twitch after death. I told myself anything to keep my hands moving, to keep the shovel digging. But before I covered his face, he said something. Not loud, not even a word, just a gasp, a reaching. I remembered it now like a scream. He had tried to speak, and I had buried him anyway. I hadn't told anyone. Who would believe me? Who would care? He had no name, no papers, no family. He was trash to the system, and I was just a worker with too much to lose. But now I was hearing him again. You buried me. Before I could speak, my knees hit the dirt. I pressed my palms to the grave. I'm sorry. Silence. Then, say it louder. The words came with a push, not sound, but pressure. The ground pulsed beneath me like a heartbeat. The trees around me groaned as if bowing toward the grave. I shouted, I'm sorry, I was afraid, I didn't know. The earth did not move, but the grave did, just slightly. A crack opened in the center of the mound, not wide, barely enough to slip a hand through, but deep and dark and breathing. From that hole, the cold rose like smoke, and with it, his voice again. You took my voice, so now I borrow yours. I felt it immediately, a tightness in my throat. My mouth opened, but nothing came out, not a sound. I pressed my hands to my neck, panicked. I couldn't speak, I couldn't scream. My own voice, gone, stolen. No, not stolen, given, in exchange, a final request. He didn't want resurrection. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to speak, to tell his story, and he needed my mouth to do it. The silence stretched. I stood, dizzy, clutching my chest. The grave was whole again, the crack gone, the earth calm, but I was not. The next morning I tried to talk to the grounds manager. Nothing came out. He waved me off, said I looked pale, said to take a few days off. I nodded, but I didn't leave. I couldn't. I spent the next night in the tool shed, listening. And as I sat there, mouth sealed by guilt and soil, I began to hear something strange. My own voice, coming from the grave, telling a story. One I didn't know I remembered. About a man left behind. About a burial that should never have happened. About a name that had been taken and then returned. Piece by piece each night my voice would rise from the dirt and confess, until I had nothing left to say, and that's when I understood. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a transfer. He had been waiting for someone to carry the weight of what was done, and I was the only one left who knew, so I gave him my voice, because I owed him that much, because 17 years ago, I stole his silence, and now, silence is all I have. There are certain things you tell yourself just to keep walking, lies so quiet, so soft, that they pass as thoughts. I told myself I was still in control, that the voice from the grave would fade, that my silence was temporary, that maybe, if I just stopped listening, he would stop speaking. But the truth is, silence doesn't leave you. It invades you. It becomes your skin, your breath, your shadow, and now it followed me everywhere. I'd stopped going home. There didn't seem to be a point anymore. My apartment was just a shell filled with echoes I didn't want to hear. The cemetery had become the only place where I felt anything close to grounded. Not safe, never safe, but tethered. At least there, I knew who I was, or who I used to be. The morning it happened, there wasn't even a warning. No chill in the air, no whispers, no signs. I stepped outside the shed like I did every morning, and immediately noticed something was wrong. It wasn't anything dramatic. The air didn't smell of rot. The sky wasn't black. The birds were still chirping in the distance. But the wind had changed. It didn't move around the graveyard. It moved through it, like it had somewhere to be. I made my way to Section E with slow, deliberate steps. Each one felt like a question, like the ground was daring me to keep going. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the temperature wasn't cold. My hands trembled before I saw it, before I understood. Grave 547 was open, not disturbed, not dug up. Open, perfectly cut, 4 sharp corners. The mound gone. The soil smooth, placed in a neat pile to the side. No footprints, no tool marks, no sign that a single finger had touched the earth. The coffin, gone. Not lifted, absent, like it had never been there. I stood frozen, staring into a rectangle of darkness. Nothing looked wrong, and yet everything was. There were no roots dangling from the edge, no worms. The walls of the grave were smooth as marble. It looked clean, too clean, like it wasn't meant for decomposition, like it had never held a body, but I knew that wasn't true. Because I had heard him, because I had buried him, because I had apologized to him. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to run, but something held me in place. Not fear, not paralysis, something deeper, a knowing. I took a step forward. The air above the grave was heavy, pressing against my chest like deep water. I knelt slowly, knees sinking into the damp grass, and looked closer. At the edge of the hole, placed precisely where the head of the coffin would have been, sat a pair of boots, caked in dried mud, torn at the heel, old, worn, familiar. I knew those boots. I had worn those boots, years ago. They'd gone missing not long after that first burial. I thought I'd left them in the shed and someone had tossed them out. I even blamed the night crew at one point. But now they sat here, silent, heavy, waiting. The laces were tied the way I used to tie them. The left boot still had the scuff from the time I tripped carrying tools. I stared at them, my mouth hanging open, my throat still useless. And in that moment, something inside me split open. I didn't forget who I was. I remembered who I wasn't. I wasn't the one who buried him. Not only. I was the one who stood at the edge of a grave 17 years ago and obeyed. I was the one who heard a dying man try to speak and chose silence. I was the one who let the dirt fall. But I wasn't just a witness. I was a mirror. Something had been watching me all along. Not with eyes, but with presence. Measuring me, preparing me, until the time came to replace what had been taken. The boots weren't a message. They were an invitation. I reached out, touched the left one. It was warm, not sun warm, body warm. I recoiled, fell backward, heart racing. The ground beneath me rumbled, no louder than a growl, like a throat clearing beneath the soil. Then, silence again. Complete, total, too total. I realized I could no longer hear the birds, or the wind, or my own heartbeat. It was as if the world had been muted, not because of the grave, because of me. I opened my mouth to scream. Nothing, not even a breath. I wasn't just voiceless anymore. I was soundless, erased, layer by layer. And grave 547? It was still open, but now it looked less like a hole and more like a space that remembered what had been taken from it. I backed away slowly, never turning my back to it. The boots remained still. No figure emerged, but I felt it. Something standing just beneath the threshold, just out of sight, waiting for me to finish what I started 17 years ago, waiting for me to step in. And maybe I would have, maybe I should have, but I ran. For the first time since this all began, I ran, back to the shed, slamming the door behind me, dropping the lock. I don't remember how long I sat there, hunched over the bench, hands pressed to my ears as if the silence itself could be blocked. Hours passed, maybe days. No one came. No one ever came anymore. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just waited, because I knew what was next. The grave had opened itself once. It wouldn't wait long, and eventually, everyone has to lie down, especially those who stand too long beside a hole they made, especially those who were meant to fill it. I stopped counting the days. Out there, time still passed. Light came, light went. But inside the shed, it held its breath. The walls didn't rot, and the hinges didn't rust. Nothing moved unless I moved it, and even then, it felt like I was disturbing a stillness that wasn't mine. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was waiting, not for rescue, not even for punishment. I was waiting for something I couldn't name, because whatever it was had already begun to happen inside me. The grave hadn't closed. That much I knew without checking. Some mornings, I swore I heard the boots shuffle in the grass just beyond the wall. At night, I'd dream of breathing through soil, my mouth packed with roots, my eyes open and staring at the underside of the world. I'd wake up with dirt under my nails, blood in the corner of my mouth, my throat raw from screams I didn't remember giving. Or maybe I hadn't screamed at all. Maybe I'd only heard it echo from below. The worst part wasn't the silence anymore. It was the recognition. Each day, I saw less of myself in the mirror nailed to the tool cabinet. My face was duller, skin paler, eyes sunken. But it wasn't just exhaustion or fear. It was exchange. A quiet trade taking place just beneath the surface. Like someone had lifted a mold from me and was using it to make something else. Some version of me that didn't remember. I hadn't seen another living soul in weeks. No deliveries, no co-workers, no visitors to the cemetery. Even the groundskeeper who sometimes stopped by for payroll had gone silent. I left the gate unlocked once, just to see if anyone would notice. It stayed ajar for 3 days, then shut on its own during the night. That was the moment I understood what was happening. The world hadn't forgotten me. I had been removed from it, like a page torn from a book no one finishes. No obituary, no absence noticed, just a space where something used to be. And in that space, the cemetery grew quieter, but not empty, never empty. I walked back to Section E one last time, long after midnight, barefoot, clothed in the same coveralls I'd worn since the grave first opened. The grass was wet, not with dew, but with something thicker, darker. I didn't check what it was. I didn't need to. I knew it came from below. Grave 547 waited, still open, still perfect, still exactly the same. But now, I could see things in it. Reflections. Not water, not light. Memories. I saw myself as a boy, hiding under a stairwell, watching as 2 caseworkers argued over which home would take me in. I saw my first day on the job, my hands trembling as I signed the contract, the pen nearly slipping from my grip. I saw the man's face, the one I buried 17 years ago, his lips twitching, his eyes fluttering, trying to say something I wouldn't hear. I saw it all, not as visions, as proof. The grave wasn't just a hole, it was a record of all that was buried and all that had done the burying. And now it had room for one more. I didn't step in, not yet. I sat down, on the stone bench beside it, the one I used to clean every Sunday, back when I still believed this place was just a place. The bench was colder than the ground, made of black granite, carved with no inscription. I used to think it was a memorial that had never been finished. Now I understood it was a placeholder, not for a body, for a witness. A seat for the one who had seen what shouldn't be seen and lived long enough to carry the weight. And so I sat, and I stayed, day after day, night after night, not moving, not speaking, just watching. The grave never closed, not fully, but sometimes in the late hours, I'd hear footsteps behind me, soft, uneven, like someone dragging a shovel through sand, and I wouldn't turn around. I didn't need to. He was here, not haunting me, not even replacing me, just becoming me, and I was becoming him. The man whose name was lost, the man whose voice was buried, the man who only wanted to be remembered. And now, in this space between graves and memory, someone would, because I am still here, breathing, waiting, on this bench beside the grave, in case you come, in case you listen, in case you try to forget someone who whispered, just once, before the dirt covered their mouth, because when you do, I'll be waiting for you too.